Welcome to WSIU On Topic. I'm Jennifer Fuller. The midterm elections are done. The ballots have been cast and the votes have been counted. And now we take a look at what that all means. Our guests this week include Jak Tichenor of Illinois Lawmakers on Public TV and the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute's John Jackson, as well as SIU Political Science Chair Tobin Grant. Gentlemen, thanks for coming in. Of course, it's a big deal when you have a midterm election. We always talk about what happens after the president's been in office for a couple of years. And now we take a look at that. There was this talk of a blue wave. We heard talk of at least one local lawmaker saying, well, no, it's going to be a red tsunami. So, Jak, let's start with you.
Well, there was a blue wave in Illinois, particularly in the suburbs around Chicago and in other places. If you look here, you can actually see in the governor's race, the J.B. Pritzker picked up a lot of counties. Go back to 2014, Bruce Rauner got every county except Cook. So the wave is definitely there. The suburbs went blue, Pritzker won them. The GOP lost 2 congressional seats there. The Democrats picked up most of the 6 House seats that they picked up in the suburbs, one further south. They may pick up another one in the suburbs before it's over. The Senate Democrats also picked up at least 2 seats, maybe even one more. So that's incredible. That's
big for the state of Illinois, and of course we'll get back to that. When you look at things on a national level, we did see numerous congressional districts flip to blue. I believe I read that New York State's congressional delegation is now completely in Democratic control. Tobin, what does this mean now that there is Democratic control of the U.S. House? How does that change policymaking in Washington?
Right. The key thing that it does that the Democrats are going to be able to do is act as a check on the executive branch. And so what we've seen over the past 2 years hasn't been a tremendous amount of policy coming out of DC, though we did have the tax cuts and some other things, but we didn't see a check on or investigations or just oversight in a real meaningful way. And so we're not going to see a thing where the Democrats are able to push forward an agenda. It's just not going to get through the Senate, and if it does, it's not going to go past the White House. So, but what you will see are oversight. What are you guys doing? What's going on in these executive branch and assignments and things like that?
We heard leaders on either side of the aisle saying, well, if you'll start an investigation, then we'll launch our own investigation. John, does this lead to any sort of bipartisanship in your mind?
There are possibilities in some places, but those are very, very limited possibilities. And going back to Jak's point, certainly there was a red wave in southern Illinois and a blue wave across Illinois otherwise. And that's true across the country, but there was no wave election per se. There were a lot of individual elections in individual states and congressional districts, and we went into this election deeply divided. The campaign was as divisive, maybe most divisive ever, because the divisiveness was led by the President of the United States. And it went on and on and on. He mobilized his base. The blue base was already mobilized. So out of a very divisive election season comes a divided government. And it's going to be very difficult under this circumstance to do a great deal of legislation. I think Tobin's right about the possibilities, but they'll be very limited, and the investigatory powers of the Congress will be used, and Trump will react as angrily as he reacted in that press conference yesterday, and that will exacerbate the division. So long and short is 2020 is upon us.
Well, that gets to my next question. Do we automatically jump into President Trump's reelection bid? Are we already in campaign mode even before the next session of Congress even starts?
Well, that's what all of those mini 45 trips were about. That was Trump campaigning mostly for Trump, mostly for 20. And he went to all those red states and all those red congressional districts. So really 2020 started in this campaign, and certainly it was on in the press conference.
And he said it was a referendum on his presidency. Yeah. He made that very clear in many of those campaign stops that he made for the House and the Senate Republicans.
Right. Getting a little closer to home, Jack, you mentioned the fact that there were some big Democratic wins in the state of Illinois. We looked 4 years ago when Governor Rauner won, and a lot of people said, well, Democratic voters didn't come out for Pat Quinn. Is this a Republican voters didn't come out for Bruce Rauner, or is it a different result?
I think the House Republican leader in Springfield, Jim Durkin, put it pretty aptly. Said the governor underperformed downstate, and clearly in other areas like the suburbs. The polling had pretty much shown J.B. Pritzker with a comfortable 15 to 16 point lead all the way through for the last several months. There was a high point of 22 points, wasn't it, in the Simon poll back in early October, but a comfortable double-digit lead, and that held right till the end. So it was about a 15-point victory for J.B. Pritzker. It's an interesting situation now. You had Pritzker's money worked in two different ways. He spent about $171 million of his money on the governor's race. That left the House Republicans, the House Democrats and Senate Democrats in Illinois with a free hand to raise as much money as they could and spend it on those races we were talking about. Mike Madigan was looking at around $20 million in funding that he raised. They went on the air in Chicago media markets for those House candidates running against Donald Trump, trying to tie the House Republicans to Trump. And to a certain extent that worked. Interestingly, the president's bad numbers in the Chicago area worked against Republicans. The president's good numbers downstate worked for Republicans like Mike Bost in the 12th Congressional District.
Absolutely. So we also saw that in Wisconsin, a Democratic governor was elected. How does that change the way that Illinois works with its neighbors? We saw a lot of Governor Rauner talking about how Indiana was taking jobs or Wisconsin was taking jobs. Is there any camaraderie that's built here with a new governor in the office?
That's hard to say, but they're basically all going to be working to try to get jobs to their own state. That's kind of the mantra that you're always going to hear. I think the thing that was going on between Wisconsin and Illinois was Bruce Rauner was wanting to try to replicate what Scott Walker did in Wisconsin by decimating the public employee labor unions up there. The thing that was different was Scott Walker had a Republican House and Senate to work with. And here, of course, Bruce Rauner ran up against two Democratic majorities.
Jack mentioned Republican Mike Bost, who won over Democrat Brendan Kelly and the Green Party's Randy Auksher on Tuesday. A lot of people were really thinking that this might be a race that could flip, that could go to Democratic control. John, the 12th Congressional District leans Republican. Is it now solidly Republican?
Oh, I think so. I don't think the Democrats will be able to recruit a better candidate than Brendan Kelly was, and that means this district is a Republican district for the foreseeable future. Bost rode Trump's coattails very effectively, and the fact that Trump is obviously very popular in this area, except for Alexander and Jackson counties, tells you all you need to know about the future prospects, immediate future prospects for the Democrats.
How does that change messaging for Democrats going into the 2020 election, both at the national level and at the local level?
They're going to have to find some Joe Machinis. He's the West Virginia guy with a worse district in his state than we had here. They've got to have some people like him who are in the middle of the road and who can appeal to rural voters, and they've not been able to unlock that problem.
They could look also to Sherry Bustos in the Quad Cities area, whose district was carried by President Trump last time, and she's managed to hang on, and she'll be part of conceivably the new leadership team in the Democratic House. She's done very well in being able to talk to those rural voters, make the connections with the blue collar folks that are now voting more and more for Republicans. But she's been able to tap into that and work very effectively.
Tobin, each side is claiming victory here. The president says the Republicans won. Democrats are saying, Nancy Pelosi are saying, the Democrats won. Is there a party that can go back to Washington and say, we have the momentum and this is the direction the country wants to go?
Yeah, I mean, it's really difficult. I mean, it was a win more for the Democrats than the Republicans. The Democrats, just because of accidents of history, just had a lot more seats that were up for grabs. They happened to be up for grabs, again, just based on history, ones that they tend to have a lot of Democrats in reddish, if not solid red states. And so they weren't able to get a lot of gains that way, and it was just a mathematics against them, whereas the Democrats were able to have gains. And then you have other ones like, if you look at Illinois, even though you have things like the 12th Congressional District, other ones, I believe in every congressional district that had a Democratic opponent, the Democrats did better this year than they did 2 years ago. It was just a matter of if it was a 22-point increase or a 4 or 5 point increase. And so that was the real story of it.
Jack, we talked right after the election, and you talked about the collar counties, those counties right around Cook County, changed more from purple to a deeper shade of blue.
They did, in fact. And we've seen that borne out, of course, with the governor's race. We've seen that with those congressional races, with those House and Senate races for the Illinois General Assembly. There were also some gains, of course, downstate as well for the governor. Picked up Champaign County, of course, the new governor, J.B. Pritzker, governor-elect. Champaign County was interesting in that Democrats swept all those county offices there. And in the suburbs, they also made substantial gains in those county offices and the like. So I think the thing to remember here is Pritzker was also sending a lot of money out to local Democratic organizations. He's trying to build a ground game for Democrats in the state of Illinois. That is significant, and he's starting to see some payoff in that.
We've talked a lot about what that means for Washington. I want to get to some of the statewide implications here. Jack, you're going to be headed back to Springfield for the veto session here in just not that long.
No, end of the month.
What does this mean? Do the lame duck representatives and senators, does a lame duck governor have anything that they're going to toss out there?
I don't think there's going to be an awful lot. I think labor unions are concerned, particularly AFSCME, to see if there's any last-minute attempts to try and put further controls on them before Bruce Rauner leaves office. I don't think that there's going to be a great deal of activity in the veto session. Everyone's looking forward now to the fact that Democrats might have as much as a 74-seat supermajority in the Illinois House. The Democrats in the Senate might be as high as 40 seats, leaving 19 for the Senate Republicans. There's a couple of these races that are still in the single digits to double digits, and the mail-in ballots are a factor. There's also provisional ballots that still have to be counted. So I think the balance of power clearly goes to the Democrats. How do they use that? Do they move toward putting a progressive income tax on the ballot in 2020? Do they look at revenue sources like legalizing recreational marijuana? There's all sorts of different things. I think the key challenge right now, though, is to try and restore fiscal stability to the state of Illinois for everything from social service agencies to universities. You've got to get that in order. Pension reform will be a part of this. I think a capital bill is on the horizon. Illinois hasn't had a capital bill, a realistic capital, a big capital bill since the Quinn administration. So there's tens of billions of dollars of projects that are out there. Now, the question is, where does the revenue source come from to actually fund that? But when you put people back to work, it generates more tax income, or more taxes, generates a lot of economic activity. So I think there'll be a really big push for that.
I know the University of Illinois is talking about going to the legislature with a big increase in terms of what they got from the state last year, and they say it's in order to restore
a 16% budget increase for the University of Illinois. I know when the House Higher Ed Committee was on campus here a few weeks ago, they were talking pretty much about trying to make sure that more money went to all the universities in the state. And they said a lot of what happened with Carbondale wasn't necessarily a problem of Carbondale's making. It was a problem that the state wasn't actually stepping up and doing its fair share for universities.
When we talk about doling out the money, we talk about where the control is, and Jack mentioned the fact that it's a big Democratic majority both in the House and the Senate. John, in Southern Illinois, that's not the case. The legislative delegation from Southern Illinois is all Republican.
Yeah, the legislative delegation here won't have much clout, so what we have to depend on is statewide initiatives, which we will very much benefit from. I think in addition to Jack's agenda, the agenda won't be in the veto session, but in the January session, and it will include very quickly some consideration of things like a minimum wage increase. All the Democrats and even some Republicans, I think, will support that. It will include doing something about those without health care insurance, and because of the destruction of some parts of the Obamacare ACA Act, that's got to be dealt with, and I think Pritzker and Democrats will want to deal with that, and I think some Republicans may want to go along with that as well. They promised no destruction of the pre-existing conditions, so let's see what they can come up with, and particularly what will Republicans support.
There was a shift that we saw with Republicans bucking the governor's wishes and voting for a budget. Do you think that continues in this?
I think the Republicans down here and throughout the rural parts of the state are going to have to figure if they can get on board and can they make some coalitions with Democrats to get something done. We used to have coalition governing fairly often that advantaged Southern Illinois, but it's not been there lately.
I think one of the things that points positively in that direction, John, is the fact that Jim Edgar, the former Republican governor, is a co-chair of this new transition team for J.B. Pritzker. There's clearly been some outreach going back and forth between Pritzker and Edgar in recent months, where it sounds as though that Pritzker has reached out to Jim Edgar, and Edgar has talked to him about the ways that he got things done, even against in uphill battles sometimes, butting heads with Mike Madigan. But he actually got things done with Democrats in control of the other chambers.
Yeah, one of the things that I'm going to be watching coming up is exactly what the Republicans in the state, how they're going to see themselves, because it used to be this kind of unhappy marriage of the border counties that were the Chamber of Commerce, economic but moderate on social issues, and that was the Bruce Rauner kind of coalition, and the southern part of the state going along with it. Now, if you cut that off and they become part of a larger Democratic control, or they at least have that. Now we've got a Republican Party that's primarily downstate, primarily rural. And then it becomes, okay, so what are you going to be pushing for? What are the things? And they're not going to, I don't see them fighting over minimum wage, and they certainly not like a capital bill. So what does it become? Because the social issues aren't the same sort of fight that we have here in Illinois as other ones. It's not economic driven in the same way it was before. So it's going to be really interesting to see how they see themselves and what they decide to.
I think you make a really good point. I think you'll see some cooperation in areas like a capital bill, because they've already, some of those, at least 10 of them have already said we were on board for a tax increase. 1 in the Senate, 10 in the Illinois House. So they're going to want to be a part of some of that. I think there's also room for cooperation on a gaming expansion bill. A number of the licenses, including the one closest to us for Walker's Bluff, those are now in Republican districts. The one in Rockford, that's largely a Republican area. So I think there's room for them to work together if they put their minds to it.
When you see it, I'm sorry, John, go ahead.
I think a tax on sports betting would be a part of that too. And there have been studies that indicate that could be $1 billion, maybe $2 billion. They've got a deficit right now of about 1.5. And that's easily done. There are already 6 states that have taxes on sports gambling.
That's something that could come up in the veto session as well if they want to get out ahead of that. When you talk about a new governor coming in and a new legislature coming in, a capital bill is almost always a part of that conversation. Spending is always a part of it. Well, we're going to make things better by bringing new things and building new buildings, but the revenue has to follow that. And we've touched on that a little bit, an expansion of gaming, potentially recreational marijuana. Is that something that's on the table?
The bill's already been filed in the Senate, and Heather Staines from Chicago has already has the bill. Kelly Cassidy in the House. That's going to be a heavy lift, though. A lot of the Republicans and a lot of the downstate Democrats are not going to be jumping with joy for something like that, because that's a fairly tough sell. Now, the polling has shown that roughly 66% of Illinoisans favor regulating and then selling it like alcohol and taxing it like we do alcohol. But that's still a big lift for a lot of the downstate members.
One of the big questions that Governor-elect Pritzker had during his campaign is he really advocates for a progressive or a graduated income tax, but he didn't have a lot of details about what that would look like. Is that going to be a hindrance as he tries to head into gaining more revenue?
Well, he said that he wanted to negotiate that with the General Assembly, and that's clearly what he's going to have to do. He stayed vague on that, and he was advised to stay vague on that because you don't want to get yourself roped into something and have all the next set of ads come out, against you and anyone who's with you on how much you're going to raise that tax. They'll have to take a look at that. Other states do it with a variety of different brackets, and we'll have to see how that comes together.
All of that then comes to a head in 2020. Any change to the tax code would have to come before the voters in 2020. When we look at a potential re-election bid from President Trump or whoever the Democratic nominee will be, how does that change how voters might look at that in 2020?
Well, the graduated income tax is not even going to be relevant until 2021 at the earliest. I don't think Pritzker's going to come out running hard on that. I think he'll want to take care of the immediate. He's got to put an FY 2019 budget and in 2020 into place. And he may get that out in the second year, but I don't think it's going to be a part of the conversation. Certainly not a part of the solution anytime soon.
Well, he's already kind of cooled off on the idea of trying to jumpstart that by kind of doing an artificial, if you will, progressive income tax by handing out a lot of tax exemptions for the working poor. He's already kind of cooled his jets on that, so he's going to be fairly cautious about it, I think.
What about looking ahead to 2020 in terms of how that strategy plays out? Will Illinois be a big contender in the national scene?
I expect it to be like it's been the last few years. Actually, how many back 1990s? I mean, when's the last time we right? Where it's going to be your solid. I mean, it should be one that whoever the Democrat is should be counting on. I mean, it would have to something. It's hard to imagine how it's not going to be that case.
George H.W. Bush was the last one.
Presidential. And if we had a different president that was running for re-election, but with Trump running for re-election, I just think it's impossible. Which means we shouldn't have as many campaign ads, locally around here. So that's one plus.
And as we look ahead from that, we're talking about congressional districts being drawn. We're talking about the potential for Illinois looking at a different way to draw its congressional and state legislative districts.
Right.
Is there a big groundswell of support for change here? I know there have been polls that say, yes, the public wants this.
Won't happen before 2020, though, and that's the one it's relevant for. I think Illinois is going to lose one and perhaps two. And if we lose even one, they're going to look at downstate and they're going to look at Southern Illinois. Right. You're going to see the Davis congressional district, which he almost lost, by the way, the other night. You're going to see that district and the Shimkus district and the Boss district become one or two districts. And let's say Shimkus retires, you could see Davis versus Boss, for example. Shimkus doesn't retire, then somebody's going to be sacrificed because it's going to be Shimkus and somebody out of that other two.
And there's precedent for that. We saw that with
Right.
Democrats. We saw that Glenn Pichard was drawn into Terry Bruce's district. Pichard ultimately prevailed there. Same thing happened when David Phelps was drawn into Shimkus's district. Shimkus is still there.
Right.
What should voters be talking to their lawmakers about in the next several weeks before those new sessions start, both in Washington and in Springfield? If they needed change to happen, what's the best thing to be telling them in this time?
Stick up for health care and pre-existing conditions. They haven't solved that problem. When you took off the individual mandate, you destroyed the pool for pre-existing conditions to be a realistic pool. Any kind of health insurance that's going to be available for those folks is going to be way beyond their means, and nobody has a solution for that, and certainly the Trump administration hasn't had a solution.
Jack, I'm going to give you the last word in about a minute or
Uh-oh.
so. What are we going to see from the Illinois lawmakers in the veto session and then in the lame duck session?
I don't think you're going to see an awful lot when it comes to substantial action in the veto session. I haven't heard any rumblings of that at this point. In fact, there may be, it may be a situation where the new governor-elect says, fellas, don't do any, or ladies and gentlemen, don't do anything radical at that point. Let me have a chance to get my administration together, and we'll talk as a group when we get into the new session that starts in early January.
Sure. And you can catch the coverage of Illinois lawmakers right here on WSIU and other public television stations. And you can tune into WSIU Radio for the latest news as well. This is WSIU On Topic. I'm Jennifer Fuller. Thanks for watching.